now forever will be. Summer and winter and springtime and harvest, sun, moon, and stars in their courses above, join with all nature in manifold witness to thy great faithfulness, mercy, and love. Faithfulness, great is thy faithfulness. Morning by morning, new mercies I see. All I have needed, thy hand has provided. Great is thy faithfulness, Lord, unto me.
The book of Nehemiah, one of the historical books of the Old Testament that in the Jewish scriptures you'd find Ezra and Nehemiah actually together. They talk about the history and the story of Israel as they return to the city of Jerusalem. And in Ezra we read about how the people of God came back to rebuild the temple. In Nehemiah we're going to look at a different construction project. So I begin a series entitled God Remembers, based on the book of Nehemiah. Now don't be afraid, we're going to the Old Testament, and at times people hear that and they think, all right, there's nothing practical I'm going to hear today. I hope that I don't get in the way of the Spirit of God using His Word, because every part of His Word is profitable for instruction and for rebuke, to help us be more what God calls us to be. In 1837, Charles Dickens published his second novel called Oliver Twist. It's about an orphan boy who was actually born into a workhouse. It was a place where people would go, families would go, who didn't have enough money to survive, and they would be overworked and taken advantage of in exchange for food. And in one of these English workhouses, Oliver Twist was born, Of course, it's a fictional story, but it's based on the life of orphans at that time in London. He became a pickpocket on the streets of London, and orphans at that time lived horrible lives. Sometimes they were sold to work for wealthy individuals. And it was during that same time that a man named George Mueller, who was a pastor, became aware of the plight of these orphans. He lived in Bristol, England, and determined that God was calling him to open a home for orphaned children. And so he started with a house that housed 30 girls, and over his lifetime, the lifetime of his ministry, actually housed more than 10,000 orphans, many of whom, because of his influence, were able to turn their lives around and were able to actually live productive lives after that. Interestingly, he was opposed by many of the people in that day who felt that what he was doing was encouraging the poor to live above their station in life. Can you hear the arrogance? And yet he recognized the calling of God in his life as a pastor to be able to reach out to these needy and helpless orphans. And if you have a chance, read the biography of George Mueller, because one of the things that stands out about him was his tremendous confidence in God to provide for him. He never went out and asked for money. And there's some great stories in his lifetime of how they came to a point where they didn't have food at the end of the day and a baker would show up and provide. And there's just a great way in which God worked through him to accomplish this. And of course, part of also what he did was encouraged and built the Sunday school movement in England so that children went to church Sunday morning and were taught instead of not being able to have access to the gospel. Now, I tell you this story because just the heart of George Mueller, that he was moved by God to say, here's a need that just really needs to be met. And the setting is at least somewhat connected as we look at the story of Nehemiah and how he was moved to meet a need in this time in which he lived. Now, it's the spring of about 445 BC, just a couple of years ago. And King Artaxerxes is in his winter palace, if you want to call it that, in the city of Susa. And Nehemiah is there with him. Nehemiah is a cupbearer, which, though it had great power, the position had great authority and prominence. The life expectancy wasn't always that long, because a cupbearer was a food taster. One of the favorite ways to get rid of royalty in that day was poison. And so he got to taste all of the food and drink all the beverages before the king did, to make sure that they were okay for the king. Nehemiah is a Jew. He's been taken captive by, originally the nation of Babylon came in and captured the people of Israel. But later on, the Persian Empire conquered the Babylonian Empire. And so now the Persians are in charge. And this is the setting in which Nehemiah receives a report from some people who come back from the city of Jerusalem. There's much more detail that I know is perhaps would help you place this in time, but I want to move to the story this morning. Words of Nehemiah, the son of Hakaliah. Now it happened in the month of Chislev in the 20th year, as I was in Susa the citadel, that Hanani, one of my brothers, came with certain men from Judah. And I asked them concerning the Jews who escaped, who had survived the exile, and concerning Jerusalem. And they said to me, the remnant there in the province who has survived the exile is in great trouble and shame. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates are destroyed by fire. First of all, I want you to see this tragic situation. Remember George Mueller, orphans who needed help. Here's a situation in which Jerusalem has no defensive wall. The temple in Jerusalem had been rebuilt by Ezra and Zerubbabel years earlier. But in that day, of course, a protective wall around the city was all that you had to keep marauders from coming in and stealing what you had. And it wasn't uncommon in that day for, say, a family to raise crops and then some type of marauders to come in, steal the crops, steal the livestock, and you've got nothing. And a wall around the city was an incredibly important thing for their safety. And so the situation is, there is no defensive wall. And it put the people in imminent danger. So that's the setting where we begin the story. People in imminent danger in the city of Jerusalem. And we read on in verse 4, as soon as I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days, and I continued fasting and praying before the God of heaven. Look at this prayer, this fervent prayer of Nehemiah. First of all, you see he was deeply moved by the plight of his people. Now think about that. Perhaps you've seen something, social media, television, whatever, regarding the suffering of people. What's your response to that? Oh, that's kind of sad. Move on to the next thing. Nehemiah instead is deeply moved so much that, did you read this? He sat for days, just inconsolable, unable to do anything, not eating, praying before the God of heaven. He fasted and prayed. And notice, I want to read further what he said when he did this. He said, Lord God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps covenant and steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commandments, let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer of your servant that I now pray before you day and night for the people of Israel, your servants, confessing the sins of the people of Israel, which we have sinned against you. Even I and my father's house have sinned. We have acted very corruptly against you, and have not kept the commandments, the statutes, and the rules that you commanded your servant Moses. Remember the word that you commanded your servant Moses, saying, if you're unfaithful, I will scatter you among the peoples. But if you return to me and keep my commandments and do them, though your outcasts are in the uttermost parts of heaven, from there I will gather them and bring them to the place that I have chosen to make my name dwell there. They are your servants and your people, whom you have redeemed by your great power and by your strong hand. O Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant and to the prayer of your servants who delight to fear your name, and give success to your servant today, and grant them mercy in the sight of this man. Now I was cupbearer to the king. Completely emotionally overwhelmed. Acknowledging, by the way, in the last verses that I read, that he knew other servants were praying for them as well. He didn't think he was the only one. But look at the way he acknowledges the promise-keeping character of God. I want to challenge you, when you pray, don't start with the thing you need. Start with realigning your understanding of God. Now, of course, it helps to study and to learn who God is. But one of the things I do in my prayer time is I've got a list of things, God's attributes, God's character, his qualities, and each day that I pray, I take one of those qualities. So God's power, God's omnipresence, his mercy, his aseity, which has to do with not being dependent on anything else. And there's just a whole number of things that I will pray before I get started. And what it does is it keeps me from jumping in, now God, I got the list here. Could you just kind of get going on this? It helps me to realign myself. This is what he did. God, this is not your fault that we're in this mess. You are a promise-keeping God. The truth is, I want you to listen to me, God, because we've sinned against you. Now, we don't know much about Nehemiah and what he had done, but he didn't just say, those terrible compatriots of mine have got us into this mess by violating the law of Moses, after which they were taken captive, and here I am, a helpless victim of my circumstance. So God, when it comes down to it, I realize that before you, I'm a sinner as well. I come from a family of sinners. Talk about family pride. Oh, Lord, I'm so proud of my family. We're all a bunch of sinners. But that's exactly the way that he prayed. And it started with just this attitude, this very different approach to God. Do you ever get angry? Do you ever get concerned? Do you ever wonder about the triumph of evil in this world? Do you ever look around you and say, God, man, do something about this? Have you ever felt at sometimes that trying to do right, to be good, to honor God, doesn't really make any difference? And look at the world around you. Here's a man who's not focused on, woe is me, I don't deserve this. Rather, I come before you, God, as I've heard this report of the people in Jerusalem. I've been moved by their situation. I'm concerned about what's going on. I intercede in prayer for them. I make specific requests of you now that you will help me to do something, or you'll do something to provide deliverance for them. I talked earlier about starting prayer by recognizing the greatness and the grandeur of God. How much of your prayer is involved in intercession? That is, when you talk to God, do you talk to him about others? Not just the person that annoys you beyond all reason, that you're praying that something will happen to get that person out of your life, but do you pray for others? Even those around you that you think are doing okay. Maybe you have family members who really honor the Lord. They walk with him. They're consistent in their lives. Do you pray that God will keep them faithful? Protect them from any influence that would pull them away? Maybe you've got family members that aren't that way, that need the Lord. How often do you ask God on their behalf? Lord, do something in their life to bring them to you. And when you see something and you see evil in this world, there's plenty of it. You look at something that's going on. You pray for the salvation of a terrible ruler who's causing pain and suffering in the world? No, actually, God, I would prefer that you would judge that person and do it right now. And that may be God's plan. But you see, if I look at myself as a sinner not deserving of the grace of God, then who am I to decide what God ought to do against everybody else to judge them? I pray, God, for those that are my enemies, as Jesus said we should do, that they would come to know the Christ who has made such a difference in my life. Now, it's true, Nehemiah is not praying those kinds of things for these people. But I want you to see his example of intercession and compassion. When Jesus saw the multitudes that were scattered abroad like sheep without a shepherd, he said in his heart, well, they deserve that anyway because they're all a bunch of sinners. Is that what it says? You know, he was moved with compassion. Moved with compassion. Explain this to me. The one who has come to earth and who is going to be tortured and killed for the sins of people who want nothing to do with him, has compassion on them? They're the cause for his death. Not ultimately. The ultimate cause is the plan of God the Father. But they are a related cause in the sense that he gave his life for their sin. And yet God works. Jesus looks at them and says, I have compassion on them because they just are so completely clueless as to what they really need. I'm coming back to this and how this impacts us. When you see the situation going on in the world around you, do you have compassion for people? When you see believers who are struggling in their faith, not doing so well, do you have compassion enough to pray for them, to ask God to do a work in their life? I am deeply concerned about this situation of the condition of the church in America. Deeply concerned about the compromises going on and the drift that's taking place. We need to pray that God will do a work to be able to accomplish his will through his church. So the story goes on in chapter 2 that in the month of Nisan, which to us doesn't mean a whole lot, but it gives us a sense of historical setting. It's the 20th year of King Artaxerxes. When the wine was before him, I took up the wine and gave it to the king. So look at the setting, picked it up, obviously tasted it, handed it to the king. And the king said to me, why is your face sad, seeing you are not sick? This is nothing but sadness of heart. Then I was very much afraid. He doesn't tell us why, but I'm guessing it didn't do you good to have a bad attitude before the king. You needed to come in smiling, and maybe part of that would also be, okay, is there a plot afoot? My cupbearer is looking kind of weird, What's taking place here? He was afraid for his own life. Could be the end of his tenure as cupbearer. The king asks and inquires into what's going on here. And he tells him, how can I be happy? My face is going to be sad. The city in the place of my father's graves lies in ruin, and its gates have been destroyed by fire. So you've got this situation. Remember, after days and days of praying and fasting, where he doesn't push the situation. It's the king who notices that he's in trouble, that he's concerned, he's worried about something. And so as he inquires of what's taking place, he tells the king, And then the king said, "What are you requesting?" Now, this is phenomenal. What do you want me to do? We have no idea the power of that kind of king in that day. That kind of power of life and death. Everything going that person's way. He's got this person in front of him who's basically a servant. And he says, "What do you want me to do? What do you request? If it pleases the king, if your servant has found favor in your sight, send me to Judah." And by the way, when you see the city of my father's graves and you think that's kind of creepy, remember that so much in that day, they were much more focused on the land that was theirs, particularly the Jewish people, and the centrality of Jerusalem to their worship. That's why he keeps bringing that up. "I want to go back and rebuild it." The king said to me, and the queen was sitting beside him, "How long will you be gone? When we return?" So it pleased the king to send me when I had given him a time. And I said to the king, "If it pleases the king, let letters be given to the governors of the province beyond the river, that they may let me pass through until I come to Judah, and a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he may give me timber to make beams for the gates of the fortress of the temple, and for the wall of the city, and for the house that I shall occupy." Okay, is there anything? Do you want the throne too? I want everything. Give me everything I need to rebuild this city's walls. And the king granted me what I asked. The next phrase is so important. "And the good hand of my God was upon me." The good hand of my God was upon me. The king granted his request because God was involved in this. It would be wrong for me to tell you, if you've got a situation in your life and you're very moved by it, very concerned, and you fast and you pray, God will do exactly what you tell him to do. But God was able, through the life of Nehemiah, to accomplish his will and purpose, in part because Nehemiah had prepared himself for just this situation. What would possess him to ask all of this for the king? Not only let me go, and now you're going to find another cupbearer, but give me all the supplies I need and give me letters so nobody bothers me. What would make him think that he could ask for that? The only thing I can conclude is that after this time of prayer, he saw this as a situation. All right, I got nothing to lose. I may lose my life right now, but I'm going to ask. And God's hand was on him, and he granted him what he needed. Now, as we read on in the story, we find out that there's some preparation that took place. He comes to the governors of the province beyond the river, gives them the king's letters. All's going great, except for a couple of people, Sanballat and Tobiah, who were displeased greatly. Now watch this. They were displeased particularly because someone was seeking the welfare of the Jewish people. Now, track with all of what's going on here. Here's a man moved with compassion, greatly concerned with the life and the plight of the people of Israel. The first thing he meets when he gets there with letters from the king is opposition from the very people who don't want him to do anything to help these people. Remember George Mueller? People who said, "Don't help those orphans, you're going to raise them above their social status where they belong." Don't go there, don't help them. Don't be concerned about the welfare of the people. So Nehemiah goes on to talk about the fact that he visited Jerusalem for 3 days, got up in the night. No one knew what he was doing. Just a few people went with him. Went by night to the Valley Gate, the Dragon Spring, the Dung Gate, all parts of Jerusalem, where the walls were broken down, the gates were missing. Went to the Fountain Gate, the King's Pool. Went to the valley to inspect the wall, turned back, entered by the Valley Gate, so returned. So he's very detailed in what he had done. The officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing, and I had not yet told the Jews, the priests, the nobles, the officials, and the rest who were there, or who were to do the work. So you've got this man moved by the situation who has just bravely asked for God to work in meeting this circumstance. A king who's been prepared by God himself, obviously, to provide all of his needs. But before he takes another step, he does some really shrewd preparation. He's very careful to plan things out. You know, don't you, that if God's in something, you don't need to prepare for it, you don't need to plan, you don't need to do anything. Just go out there and God will make it happen. That's not how it works. My pastor growing up would often say a lasting work requires extensive preparation. And what he was talking to was some of us who were preacher boys who were going out into ministry who said, why would we bother with this training? Let's just go out there and do it. There's work to be done. And pretty much what he was saying to us was, don't be stupid. You need to get ready and be prepared for what's happening. He would often talk about Jesus spending the first 30 years of his life preparing for 3 years of ministry. How important it is to get ready. And this is what Nehemiah did. Not assuming that somehow this is going to come together because God was with him. And he held counsel regarding what God had moved him to do with a very small group of people and made sure that he himself was well informed before recruiting anybody else to join with him. I mean, it all sounds really good at this point. You got a couple guys that aren't real happy. But for the most part, this is a story of what God can do when someone who's moved by a certain situation comes before him in prayer and says, please do something. And so we see miraculous provision, but then we turn the page and we read this. I said to them, you see the trouble we are in, and how Jerusalem lies in ruins with its gates burned. Come, let us build the wall of Jerusalem that we may no longer suffer derision. And I told them, now these are all the leaders, I told them of the hand of my God that had been upon me for good. Watch that phrasing here. The hand of God is on him. The words of the king that he'd spoken to me. And they said, let us rise up and build. So they strengthened their hands for the good work. There's this mixed response that he gets. First of all, he presents them with this clear call to action. He credits God with all the providential work that's gone on. And the rulers catch his vision. They say, let's do it. Let's get it done. But when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite servant and Geshem the Arab heard of it, they jeered at us and despised us and said, what is this thing that you are doing? Are you rebelling against the king? Then I replied to them, the God of heaven will make us prosper, and we his servants will arise and build. But you have no portion or right or claim in Jerusalem. I want to pull this together if I can. Tough thing about preaching Old Testament stories a lot of times is that we look at them and say, all right, I understand this, it's important, but what does this tell me? What should I do with this? First of all, remember that many parts of Scripture, especially historical sections, are not necessarily intended for us to apply them directly to our lives. So it's not saying to you, the next time you have a need, just boldly ask somebody in power and you'll get it. That isn't the point of the story. If we're going to look at it and understand what it's saying to us, first of all, we need to deal with the question of compassion. How compassionate are you toward people who need something, who are in trouble, who are suffering? And particularly, is your compassion God-informed? See, when George Mueller reached out to those orphans, he knew they needed a place to sleep and food to eat. But he also presented them with the gospel, their greatest need. When you look at the people that you go to school with, when you look at the people you work with, people in your neighborhood, people you interact with, do you ever feel compassion for them? I watch people sometimes as I maybe walk through a store. I look at some of the conflict, some of the meanness they show to each other. And I think, what a difference it could make in their life if they knew the Lord. If God could come in and heal whatever it is that's troubling them. I hope that'll be who we are. The last thing this world needs is more Christians, more arrogant about how wonderfully superior we are to everyone else. And compassion will keep you from that. Compassion keeps you humble as you look at the needs of those around you. Secondly, I want you specifically to look at your life, your prayer life right now, and ask, how is your intercession going? Do you pray for people each week? If so, you ought to have a list. Do you have a list of people that you pray for each week? And it's great to look at Nehemiah's story where things moved like that right away when he prayed. I know people that have prayed for others for years, for their salvation, for things to be turned around in their lives. There are people in my life that I have prayed for years that they would come to Christ. You might ask, well, don't you ever aren't you tempted to give up? Yes. But I remember that the same covenant-keeping, promise-keeping God that Nehemiah prayed to is at work today. And God doesn't work on my timetable. Now, there are many times I think he should, but he does not work on my timetable. And faith, in part, is saying, God, I want to take a long enough look that if what I'm doing now has benefit 30 years from now, then so be it. Because I want to be faithfully obedient. You see that response, and by the way, you know people who have compassion because most often they are people of prayer. People with genuine compassion. Pray for people. They don't just say, I'll be praying for you, which means nothing. They really do pray when you have a need. They pray about you when you don't even know they're praying for you. In fact, you may not know that the reason you've gotten this far is because people have prayed for you. Be a person of intercession. Thirdly, what does it take for you to give up? What does it take for you to quit? Have you quit? And why? But Pastor, you don't understand. It gets so discouraging. I get so exhausted. I get so tired. Couldn't I just have something in my life go without complication? Lately, I've been talking with some people who've just had one thing after another happen to them. And it's like, God, when's this going to end? Why would I even want to keep doing this if this is what serving you is like? Here you've got this great leader, Nehemiah, who has this tremendous provision from the king to do all this stuff for God. And right away, people line up to oppose him. And we're going to look at the story as it moves forward next week. But he experienced some incredible opposition. If God is in something, he opens up a door, you get to walk through it, and there's no conflict, no difficulty at all. The way you can know God is in something is it's easy, right? Not at all. Do you know sometimes God's in something and the door actually slams in your face and breaks your nose? I mean, there are times when God may want you to do something that is, by definition, hard and difficult. But that's the way that obedience can be sometimes. And I'm speaking to you this morning because I believe there are some of you who may be at that place in your life. You're just tired of trying. Be faithful, be obedient. God is the covenant-keeping God. It is not about me. Oh, I just need more faith. No, I just need to understand who God is and be confident in his nature. And I want you to know this also. If you're hearing my voice this morning and you don't know the Lord, there are people praying for you. There are people praying for you to come to the Lord. This week I prayed for some individuals, both in our church and outside, that somehow, some way, something would happen, that they would understand the gospel and believe. We had a great time together with family this week, and for those of you that don't know, the Lawsons have some of their family here as well, and just a great time to be together. But as we were with our family, just not often that we could all get together in the same place at the same time. And so I took the opportunity to pray for them. And I prayed for my sons and their spouses, my daughter and her spouse, that they would walk with the Lord, that they would be faithful to him. They would not allow nothing to separate them from obedience to God. And I honestly level with them because my first concern is my grandchildren as they go forward, that they would my children would pass on their faith, be passionately committed to that. And I prayed for my grandchildren. I wanted them to hear me pray for them, that those who knew the Lord would learn how to walk with him and be obedient and be faithful. So long after I'm gone, they're carrying on a legacy of faith. And I prayed I have a number of grandchildren who don't yet know the Lord. They're too young to understand. And just prayed that God would open their heart one day so they would believe. I want to invite you, all of you, but particularly some of you men, who may be reluctant to do this. Men, listen. Be a man of prayer with your family. I get it. Now, I've told you the story, and you're all thinking that when I said, let's pray together, that all of my family just said, oh, goody, we've been looking forward to that all week long. Now I had to kind of wrangle them in, pull them in here. All right, I guess so. I'm not saying if you do that, everybody's going to just love you for doing it. But determined to be a person who can pray in front of others and show them your heart. I'm not saying this isn't something women need to do as well, but gentlemen, sometimes we, and I'm confessing my sin, we may run deep. We may have stuff inside here, but we don't let it out. We just don't let people see it. I'm not talking about being a more weepy man. I'm talking about being a man who's able to open up and be transparent about what God's doing in you. You say, I have a passionate faith in Christ. Let your family know. In fact, last week I talked about this, but there's a couple things I challenge you to do if you haven't done this already. First, I want you to criticize my new booklet, What is a Biblical Christian? Give me some ideas, whether it's comprehensive enough. I've tried to make it simple as a way for you to present the gospel, but also a way for you to be clear about what it means to be a Christian in this confusing age. Secondly, they're back on the table there in the back, as well as out in the foyer. There's a small booklet that tells the story of your conversion. If you've never written down your salvation story, I encourage you to do it. First of all, for yourself. So you've got the story clear. When did you become a Christian? What are the circumstances that led up to that? That'll first of all help you to be able to share your faith with others. But I can't tell you how often I've talked with family members and asked them about someone else. So when did that person, that family member, become a Christian? They say, I don't know. People need to know your story. So I encourage you to do that. Take one of those booklets, fill them out, get it together. We started a couple of years ago to record the stories of people and their faith and their conversion. I would like to record yours for your use and perhaps for the life of our church. Wouldn't it be great if on our website there could be some stories told by you of the difference Christ has made in your life? Man, that's something I'd love to see happen. We got more people than we deserve who know how to use electronic devices. They can easily record you. And the good news is, in an age of social media, it doesn't matter how bad the video is. You can still post it. So, I mean, it doesn't have to be production quality, but just sincerity, genuineness. You can see how I'm struggling to kind of pull all this together as I come to a conclusion. But I don't want you just to hear the story of Nehemiah and go, oh, that's nice, Pastor. We studied the Bible. You accomplished your purpose. I want you to enter into the story of these real people. Yes, Nehemiah lived a long time ago, but human nature has not changed. And you're going to encounter people in need. And you need to become a person of compassion. And you need to have confidence in the covenant-keeping God that we serve. In a nation where it seems that so many professing believers have abandoned their faith. You be faithful. Thank you, our God, again, for the grace that you show us through the stories of people, real people. We can enter into their situation and their circumstance. Today I'm praying for families where someone needs to step up and take some spiritual leadership, and I pray they would do that step by step, little by little. I'm praying for that person who has not yet called on Christ to save them, that today would be the day that they would turn to you in faith and believe so you could transform their lives. I pray that you'll teach us compassion so we're not wrapped up in our own little worlds, just focused on our own struggles. That you would teach us through that compassion to intercede and to pray for others. And in all of this, I ask you that the Church of Jesus Christ would be triumphant as we seek to serve you and present the gospel to this culture. I pray it in Jesus' name. Amen.